While camping in the wild forests of Alaska, the air was sharp with pine and the ground damp with the memory of rain. My son, my own flesh and blood, looked me straight in the eye, his expression as cold as the river that carved through those mountains. Without a word of hesitation, he packed up his share of supplies and slung his bag over his shoulder, leaving me with nothing. No food, no tent, not even a knife. Just before disappearing into the trees, he turned a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Bye, go meet the Grizzly." He said it as casually as if he were telling me the time of day. He thought hunger cold or a bear's claws would take care of me, leaving him free to inherit everything I had worked my life to build. But fate had other plans. When he returned home days later, expecting my obituary or at least a phone call from the authorities, I was already there, sitting calmly at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee. A smile spread across my face when our eyes met. "I have a surprise for you," I said, voice steady as steel. What happened next? You won't believe it. Before I continue, take a second to subscribe to this channel and let us know where you're listening from in the comments. The front door burst open with such force that it rattled the hinges. Mason stormed in his hoodie, dripping from the Seattle drizzle sneakers, squeaking across my hardwood floor. His hair was plastered to his forehead, eyes burning with desperation and something darker. "Dad, I need 5,000, right now." The demand hit me like a gunshot. I was still at my desk, invoices spread out before me, pen poised in my hand. For a moment I froze, not just from the words, but from the sharp edge in his tone. This wasn't a son reaching out for help. This was a man making demands with all the arrogance of someone who believed the world and my life owed him. "Mason, what 5,000 tonight?" He paced the length of the room like a caged animal, fists clenching and unclenching. "I already transferred your monthly amount last week," I reminded him, my voice heavier than I intended. "$3,000 barely covers my rent," he snapped, his voice breaking under the weight of frustration. "You think that's enough? You think that covers everything?" My flannel shirt suddenly felt too tight across my chest. Grease still clung under my fingernails from the hours I had just spent fixing Mrs. Chen's transmission. I thought of the years I had poured into these auto shops, building them from nothing, one rusty wrench at a time after Sarah died. The 18-hour days, the missed meals, the endless sacrifices to give Mason a future I never had. "Son," I said carefully, "we've talked about this. You need steady work, a real job, a plan." "Work," Mason spun around, face flushed, red eyes burning with contempt. "Why should I work when you're sitting on all this money, when you control everything like some dictator?" The word cut deeper than he knew. Dictator. I straightened my back, the old military posture instinctively taking hold. "I'm trying to teach you responsibility." "Responsibility?" He barked a bitter laugh that seemed to echo off the walls. "You want to know about responsibility? After you die, I'll be the one running your shops. I'll be the master. I'll run them better than you ever did." The words dripped like venom, hanging in the air between us. My chest tightened, not just from the insult, but from the horrifying realization that my own son could speak so casually about my death. There was no grief in his voice, no hesitation, only calculation. Behind his eyes wasn't the boy I had raised. It was greed, cold and sharp. I opened my mouth to respond, but nothing came. 20 years of single parenting, of sacrifice, of holding on to hope, that he would grow into a man his mother would have been proud of, all of it collapsed in an instant. Mason must have seen it on my face, the shock, the heartbreak. His own expression flickered, shifting as though he realized he'd let the mask slip too far. But instead of apologizing, he turned sharply toward the door. The slam shook the entire house, rattling the picture frames on the mantel. Sarah's smiling face quivered behind the glass, trembling as though she too had heard his words. I stood motionless, pen still clenched in my hand so tightly my knuckles blanched white. The silence in the room was deafening, pressing against my ears, making the sound of Mason's car engine roaring to life outside all the more unbearable. As it faded into the distance, I kept my eyes fixed on Sarah's photo, the woman I had loved, the woman I had promised to raise our son for. The frame finally stilled, but my heart did not. For the first time in years, I wondered if I had lost him forever. The next morning, I found myself standing in front of the mantel again, my hand instinctively reaching out to straighten the family photo that had rattled loose during Mason's stormy exit. Sarah's face smiled back at me from behind the glass, young, radiant, alive. She was holding 8-year-old Mason at his little league game, her arm wrapped around him, pride glowing in her eyes. The memory slammed into me like a physical blow. I was back at her funeral, the scent of lilies too strong, in the chapel, my knees weak beneath me. Mason had stood beside me in his only suit, 3 sizes too big, his small hand clutching mine like a lifeline. I'd wanted to collapse, to disappear into grief, but I couldn't. Not when he needed me. The months that followed had nearly broken me. The mortgage on the first auto shop was 3 months behind. Sarah's medical bills had drained our savings dry. But when she took her last breath, she made me promise, take care of him, give him the life I can't. I swore to her I would. That vow became my compass, no matter the cost. By Thursday, I found myself digging through old photo albums, flipping through decades of memories that now felt like evidence in a trial against myself. Each page revealed another sacrifice, another decision made in Sarah's name. Mason's private school tuition, $40,000 a year, because the public schools weren't good enough for her son. His University of Washington degree, complete with the dorm experience he insisted on. The Honda Civic I bought him for graduation, brand new, $18,000 in cash, because he refused anything used. I traced the edge of a photo from his 16th birthday, my finger trembling. Even then, something was missing in his eyes. While his classmates flipped burgers or mowed lawns, Mason spent his summers gaming late into the night, living off the monthly allowances I kept justifying as investments in his future. Now, looking at the pattern laid bare across years of photographs, I could see the truth. Every check I'd written, every mess I'd cleaned up, every crisis I'd solved with my wallet had slowly chipped away at his character. I thought I was being a good father. I thought I was protecting him. But in reality, I'd raised a stranger, someone who could look me in the eye and calculate my death like a business transaction. By Saturday evening, I sat in Sarah's old chair, the one upholstered in faded blue fabric, the one I'd never had the heart to remove. I closed my eyes and I could almost hear her voice. She would have seen this coming. Sarah always understood people better than I ever could. She would have pushed Mason to stand on his own feet, to earn every dollar, to feel the weight of responsibility before it crushed him. Instead, I'd failed her. Failed him. "I failed you, Sarah," I whispered into the empty room. The words hung in the still air, heavier than any silence I'd known. The realization settled into my bones like winter cold. I had spent 20 years trying to buy Mason's love, mistaking gifts for guidance, money for mentorship. Each payment had been less about him and more about me, my guilt, my inadequacy, my desperate attempt to fill the hole Sarah's death had left in both of us. On Sunday morning, I slid the albums back onto their shelf and returned to my desk. My hands shook slightly as I reached for pen and paper. Years of military discipline steadied my breathing as I forced myself to focus. The time for sentiment was over. I had to think clearly, now plan for possibilities I'd spent a lifetime refusing to consider. The blank page in front of me stared back like an accusation waiting for choices I wasn't ready to make. My pen hovered over the legal documents, wills, succession plans, contingencies I never thought I'd draft under these circumstances. Then the silence shattered. 1 ring, 2 rings. I froze. Mason's name glowed on the phone screen. For a moment, I thought about letting it go to voicemail, but after everything, I couldn't. My hand tightened around the phone, and I answered. "Hello, son." "Dad." "Hey, how are you doing?" His voice was bright, too bright. Artificial cheerfulness poured through the receiver like a salesman rehearsing a pitch. "I'm fine," I said slowly. "This is unexpected after our conversation last week." "Yeah, about that," Mason rushed the words. "Look, I've been thinking. I was way out of line and I want to make it right." The words came too fast, too smooth, like he'd practiced them in the mirror. My grip on the phone tightened. "Actually," he continued, "I have a proposal. Something that could fix everything between us." I waited the silence, stretching long, bracing myself for whatever came next. Military training had taught me the value of silence, of listening longer than you spoke, of letting the weight of words reveal their true intent. So when Mason's voice came through the line, casual but strangely rehearsed, I said nothing at first. "Let's go camping together in Alaska," he said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Denali National Park. Just you and me." Like when I was a kid, remember, the suggestion hit me like whiplash. I nearly dropped the phone. Mason hadn't shown the slightest interest in outdoor activities since high school. Back then, I could barely convince him to leave his video games for a family hike, let alone a week in the wilderness. Now suddenly he wanted to camp in the Alaskan backcountry. This is, very sudden. I managed my voice deliberately measured. I know. He rushed the words, layering urgency into every syllable. But here's the thing, my buddies canceled last minute, and I've got these tickets that are just going to waste. Everything's already paid for. Flights, camping gear, park permits. The whole package expires tomorrow if we don't use it. My grip tightened around the phone. The urgency felt manufactured too neat, as if designed to stop me from thinking too carefully. Mason, I said slowly, suspicion threading through my tone. When have you ever organized camping trips? He didn't miss a beat. Come on, Dad. Remember when you taught me to read animal tracks? How to start a fire with wet wood? You always said the wilderness shows a man's true character. The reference to our shared past twisted something deep in my chest. I could see it then, the two of us years ago, Sarah still alive, her laughter carrying through the trees, while I crouched beside Mason, showing him how to trace the outline of deer hooves in the mud. Those had been good times, untouched by hospital bills, mortgages, and the crushing loneliness of widowhood. Times before, I began patching over every problem with money instead of presents. This could be our chance to reconnect. Mason continued, his voice softening into what sounded like sincerity. To remember what we used to have. No distractions, no city stress, just father and son in God's country. I closed my eyes, the phone pressed hard against my ear. Inside me, two forces battled. Every rational part of my brain screamed, warning, the timing, the story about canceled friends, the sudden enthusiasm for wilderness survival. It all felt orchestrated, like a trap, baited with nostalgia. But under the suspicion, beneath the scar tissue of disappointment, there was a deeper ache. What if this was real? What if against all odds my son truly wanted to rebuild our relationship? What if he was reaching out clumsily, but sincerely? The flights leave March 25th. Mason pressed on, sensing my hesitation. Seattle to Anchorage. Then we drive up to the park. 5 days in the wilderness, just like the old times. 5 days, I repeated, drawing the words out as if testing them on my tongue. Yes, Dad. Please. His voice dropped lower, almost pleading now. These tickets are burning, and this might be our last chance to fix what's broken between us. The silence between us stretched taut and heavy. My eyes dropped to the stack of papers on my desk. The legal documents I had been drafting only hours earlier. Precautions against possibilities I prayed would never materialize. Pages filled with contingencies for betrayal, for loss, for a son who might not have my best interests at heart. And yet I heard myself say the words anyway. All right, let's do it. There was a pause, then Mason's voice brightened with triumphant relief. Really, that's fantastic. I'll text you the flight details. Meet me at SeaTac departure gate. This is going to be amazing, Dad. You'll see. The line went dead. I set the phone down carefully, my hand trembling just slightly, as though I'd just signed away something far greater than 5 days of my time. Outside, Seattle's eternal drizzle streaked the window pane, weaving gray patterns across the glass. I sat there in Sarah's old chair, staring into the rain, unsure whether I had just agreed to a chance at reconciliation or stepped willingly into my own undoing. I looked back at the documents spread across my desk, then at the pen in my hand. They sat there like silent judges, legal preparations drafted against scenarios I'd prayed would never come. Hope and preparation. Both of them, in their own way, felt like betrayal. Signing those papers meant I doubted my son. Refusing to sign meant I doubted myself. 3 days later, I folded the stack neatly and slid it into the hidden pocket of my travel bag. The papers felt heavier than mere paper had any right to be weighted with possibilities too dark to name. Each sheet whispered of trust, broken before it even had the chance to mend. At SeaTac, the terminal buzzed with the usual restless energy announcements crackling over intercoms, rolling suitcases, rattling across tile floors, the smell of burnt coffee lingering in the air. Mason was waiting by gate C12, bouncing on his heels like an overeager teenager, though he hadn't been one in years. His backpack was new too. New shiny fabric, uncreased tags still dangling from the zippers, as if this trip had been assembled overnight. When his eyes caught mine, a wide grin split his face, too quick, too stretched as if painted on. Dad, perfect timing. They just called for boarding. I studied him as I approached my training, kicking in automatically. The twitch in his left eye, the way his shoulders lifted higher than necessary, the eager words spilling too easily from his mouth. Military training had taught me to read energy, to tell when nerves hid beneath smiles. "You seem excited," I said. "Why wouldn't I be?" Mason laughed, slinging the pack onto his shoulder, with more effort than he wanted me to notice. Father-son adventure in the last frontier. When's the last time we did something like this? I let his words hang in the air. The truth was, I couldn't remember. On the first flight, he filled the silence with chatter about wilderness, photography, fresh air, and how life in the city dulled a man's instincts. His voice was animated, but his eyes flicked to his phone far too often for someone supposedly eager to disconnect. I listened, replying when it felt natural, though part of me stayed locked behind a wall watching, assessing. To pass the time, I shared stories from my Navy survival training: how to read weather patterns by the shapes of clouds, how to tell edible plants from poisonous ones, how to orient yourself by the sun when GPS fails. "You really know all this stuff?" Mason asked, pulling a pen from his pocket and scribbling notes on a napkin. 20 years in the service teaches you to be prepared for anything," I said evenly. Something flickered across his face, quick as a shadow. Admiration, yes, but also something colder, sharper. Calculation disguised as respect. Our layover in Seattle stretched longer than planned. Mason excused himself 3 separate times, each bathroom break lasting close to 20 minutes. I didn't ask questions, but my gut kept tallying every minute he was gone. Through the wide glass windows of the terminal, I watched planes taxiing across the gray afternoon sky, Alaska, inching closer with every hour. The final flight north skimmed over mountain ranges, jagged as broken teeth. Snow clung to the peaks, hard and merciless. Mason pressed his forehead to the window, pretending wonder, but his reflection betrayed him. His jaw was tight, his eyes distant. Anchorage met us with a slap of cold air and the faint smell of snow, clean but sharp in the lungs. At the rental counter, the clerk slid me the forms without fuss. Toyota 4Runner, extra insurance chains for the mountain roads. Routine, efficient. Mason hefted our gear into the trunk, but I noticed the way he favored his right shoulder, wincing just slightly when he thought I wasn't looking. "Outdoor supply store next," he announced, checking his phone again, thumbs moving too quickly across the screen. "Need to grab a few extras." At Northern Exposure Outfitters, his shopping list raised more than one eyebrow. High-powered flashlights, emergency flares, 50 feet of heavy rope, a double set of thermal blankets. He moved through the aisles with surprising certainty, choosing items that went beyond casual camping. The clerk, an older man with a face weathered by decades of Alaskan winters, looked over the pile at the counter, his fingertips marked with old frostbite scars drummed against the register. "Planning to get lost out there?" he asked dryly. Mason chuckled too quickly. "Just want to be prepared." The words echoed uncomfortably in my chest. Prepared for what Highway 3 unfurled ahead of us, a narrow gray ribbon cutting through an ocean of forest that seemed to have no end. On either side, the land rose sharply into mountains, their snow-capped peaks catching the last fractured light of the setting sun. The sky bled from gold into violet, and the shadows stretched longer across the asphalt. Every few miles, weathered road signs warned of moose crossings and winter driving conditions, quiet reminders that here in Alaska, nature always dictated the terms. "Beautiful country," I said finally. The words meant more to fill the silence than to capture the view. My voice sounded small against the vastness pressing in on us. "Yeah," Mason replied, his gaze fixed out the passenger window. His tone carried something unsettling, like satisfaction buried under casual words. "Really isolated. Miles from anywhere." The way he said it, it wasn't appreciation, it was calculation. By the time we stopped for gas, night had started to fall, wrapping the forest in thickening dark. The station was little more than a concrete island with a single pump in a store glowing harshly under fluorescent light. I slipped the nozzle into the tank, the smell of gasoline mingling with the crisp bite of northern air. Mason wandered toward the store. Through the broad glass windows, I caught sight of him. He had his phone out, pressed tight to his ear. His posture shifted, shoulders hunched, head bent, voice low and urgent. Whoever he was calling it wasn't about snacks. When he returned, I kept my tone easy. Everything all right. Saw you on the phone. He didn't miss a beat. Just checking weather conditions for tomorrow. Storm system moving in but should clear by morning. The lie slid off his tongue too smoothly, and that alone set my teeth on edge. I'd already checked the forecast myself, clear skies for the next 3 days. No storm, no flurries, nothing. I said nothing, only nodded as I replaced the nozzle and tightened the cap. But as we pulled back onto the highway, that old familiar unease began coiling in my gut, the same instinct that had kept me alive in hostile territories overseas. Something was wrong. Something I couldn't yet name. 40 miles later, the memory of his call still nagged like a stone in my boot. I glanced over. So I asked casually, what did the weather service actually say? Mason stiffened. His hand tightened on the door handle. Knuckles pale in the dashboard glow. Possible snow flurries. Nothing major. Deflection. Too quick, too rehearsed. I kept my expression neutral, let the silence stretch. Good thing we packed extra layers, I said finally. He nodded, but his jaw worked like he was grinding down words he couldn't afford to say. Around a bend, the wilderness opened up to reveal a hand-carved wooden sign, Denali National Park and Preserve. The entrance stood like a threshold into another world. Cabins, their roofs heavy with snow, were scattered among towering spruce trees. Smoke curled from a few chimneys disappearing into the frosted air. The visitor center bustled with quiet activity, unusual for March. Summer brought crowds of tourists chasing postcard views. But March belonged to the serious ones. Locals, hunters, survivalists, men and women who knew what the wilderness demanded. Mason's eyes tracked the trail maps pinned to the wall as we stepped inside. His focus was sharp too, sharp like he'd already memorized every line of those trails. The Denali Lodge Motel sat just beyond the entrance, exactly as Mason had shown me, in glossy brochure photos, rustic log construction, smoke-darkened chimneys and rooms with names like Grizzly Den and Caribou Creek. Quaint, charming to outsiders, but functional to those who needed a roof and little more. At the front desk, a young woman with windburned cheeks and calloused hands flipped through the registration book. Her accent carried the clipped practical cadence of a life lived in hard winters. First time to Denali, she asked with a polite smile. I opened my mouth to answer, but Mason stepped forward. First, his tone just a little too eager. Yes, he said, and I felt it again, that same weight in my chest. A trip that was supposed to be about reconnection suddenly felt like anything but. For him, I nodded toward Mason, who was still hovering near the trail maps. I've been to Alaska before. Military exercises. The clerk tilted her head politely, pen poised over the registration log. And which trails are you considering? Before I could answer, Mason stepped forward almost too eagerly. Talanica River, backcountry route. We want the full wilderness experience. The woman's expression shifted. Concern flickered across her face, the kind that comes from experience, not inexperience. That's advanced terrain. Very remote. Most people start with the shorter nature trails. We're experienced campers, Mason said quickly, a little too firmly, as though the words themselves might rewrite reality. His definition of experience, of course, consisted of a few weekend bonfires with friends 10 years ago. No real camping, no survival training, no nights spent alone under a hostile sky. I kept my mouth shut, though my jaw tightened. Park Ranger Jennifer Walsh entered soon after, and if the clerk had looked cautious, Walsh looked carved from Alaskan granite. She could have stepped straight out of a recruitment poster, confident, sharp-eyed, and radiating the no-nonsense authority of someone who had dragged more than a few stubborn tourists out of the wilderness alive or not at all. Her briefing room smelled of pine cleaner and burnt coffee. The walls were lined with topographical maps, wildlife photographs, and laminated safety notices warning of every danger the Alaskan wild could unleash. Gentlemen, she began spreading a detailed map across the scarred conference table. Let's be clear about what you're undertaking. Her finger traced a winding blue artery across the paper. The Talanica River route takes you 30 miles from the nearest ranger station. No cell coverage, no other campers this time of year. Once you're in, you're in. She tapped 3 red markers, each one deep in the white space of the map. Recent grizzly activity here, and here. 2 cubs spotted last week, which means a protective sow is close by. We've had wolf pack sightings. Moose are unpredictable, especially during spring territory disputes. Her eyes lifted steady and unblinking. Mason leaned forward, his focus locked on those remote stretches of wilderness, as if the danger itself was what drew him. "What about emergency evacuation, helicopter rescue possible?" Walsh said flatly. "But weather permitting, it could take days." "Days, gentlemen. If conditions turn bad, you're on your own until we can get to you." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the ticking of a clock on the wall. Walsh's expression made it clear she'd seen too many versions of us men, with more confidence than preparation, who believed they were the exception to Alaska's rules. Most had ended up as cautionary tales. "I have to ask," she continued, folding her arms. "What's your combined wilderness experience?" I answered straight. "Military background, survival training, Arctic exercises." My tone was measured, factual. Mason beside me mumbled something vague about camping with friends. The ranger's brow furrowed. The doubt in her eyes was visible, unfiltered. "Sir, with respect, this route isn't appropriate for beginners. We have excellent guided tours, shorter trails." "We'll be fine," Mason cut in, his voice firm. He gestured toward me with a half smile. "My father's practically a survival expert." I caught the ranger's look, then the kind you give when you already know how a story ends, but the characters refuse to listen. An hour later, after signing liability waivers that read, like preludes to obituaries and sitting through grainy safety videos on bear encounters, we were handed our gear, bear-resistant food containers, emergency beacons, and maps that seemed far too thin to carry the weight of what lay ahead. I added one more item to our rental list against Mason's protests: a defensive rifle, a Remington 870, heavy and familiar in my hands. The steel was cold, but the weight steadied me in a way nothing else could, because I knew better than Mason did. This wasn't a vacation. This was survival. "You sure about that?" Mason asked, his voice thin with unease. His attempt at a grin didn't reach his eyes. "Alaska rule number 1," I reminded him quietly. "Never go unarmed in bear country." Our final stop before the trailhead was a small outbuilding attached to the ranger station, where the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead. Ranger Walsh stood in front of us with the calm authority of someone who had delivered this speech 100 times before, some of those times to people who never made it back. She held up the bright orange emergency beacon, its edges scratched from years of use. "Push this button, hold for 5 seconds, and search and rescue will receive your exact coordinates." She demonstrated slowly, her gloved thumb firm and deliberate. "But remember, out there, even with GPS coordinates, rescue could still take 12 to 18 hours minimum. That's in good weather. In bad weather." She let the silence hang as if the unfinished sentence was a warning in itself. I tucked the device into my pack like it was the last lifeline I'd ever hold. Loading our gear into the truck, I felt the familiar pre-mission tension coiling inside me. That taut wire of anticipation I knew too well from deployments, when every breath, every sound, every detail could be the one that saved or ended you. And here every detail screamed caution: the remoteness of the route, Mason's obvious lack of experience, his strange, almost obsessive insistence on maximum isolation. As the ranger station shrank in the rearview mirror, swallowed by a forest of black spruce, I asked one more time, "Still sure about this route?" Mason's smile looked wrong. Too stiff, too practiced. "Absolutely. No turning back now, right, Dad?" The way he said it landed in my ears like a weight. Not encouragement, not camaraderie, more like finality. Through the mirror, I caught one last glimpse of the ranger station, a lone cabin of light in the growing wilderness, our last thread to civilization. And then it was gone, lost behind the tree line. What stretched ahead was not adventure, it was something else. Something closer to entrapment. The road narrowed as we pressed deeper, the gravel thinning to ruts, the branches closing in until they scraped along the truck's sides like skeletal fingers trying to drag us in. My GPS flickered, the screen confirming what I already knew. Each mile took us further past the last cell tower, beyond the final marked trail, deeper into the kind of country that swallowed unprepared travelers whole. "We're officially off the grid now," I murmured, watching the signal bars vanish from my phone. Mason's laugh came sharp, hollow, unnatural. "Perfect. Just us and nature." But I didn't hear joy in it. I heard something else. Mile 23. The drivable road ended at a crude signpost, two weathered wooden markers leaning in the fading afternoon light. They looked less like trail signs and more like grave markers. I pulled over and killed the engine. Silence rushed in thick and heavy, broken only by the ticking of cooling metal. We shouldered our packs. Mine rested against me with the practiced balance of years of military training. Mason's, though, bulged awkwardly, straps biting into his shoulders, gear stuffed without order weight, pressing down in all the wrong places. "Jesus, this thing weighs a ton," he muttered, fighting the straps, his breath already labored. "Proper packing takes practice." I stepped forward to help, shifting the weight across his frame, the way you learn only by years of carrying too much too far. His face tightened when I adjusted one strap, a wince he tried to hide. "You hurt yourself," I said, watching his shoulders stiffen. He forced a chuckle. "Old injury, nothing serious." But the way he said it brushed off too quickly, too casually, settled uneasily in my gut. Another half-truth. Another piece of the puzzle that didn't fit. The trail wound deeper into the spruce forest, a dark corridor where afternoon sunlight barely pierced through the canopy. Long skeletal branches knit together overhead, muting the sky to a pale green glow. Moss-covered logs blocked our path like nature's barricades, forcing us to climb, crawl, and steady ourselves on damp, slippery bark. Small streams, their surfaces glinting faintly in the dim light, cut across our way, demanding careful balance on stones polished smooth by centuries of water. Every step carried the weight of silence and watchfulness. Signs of wildlife appeared almost immediately. Massive moose tracks, deep wide, impressions in the mud, spoke of creatures that could crush bone with a single charge. Overhead, the haunting cry of an eagle carried through the stillness, sharp and commanding, a reminder that even in this emptiness, we were watched. And then came the sound, distance stretched across miles of forest, the low, chilling chorus of wolves. You hear that Mason froze his boots, sinking slightly into the damp earth. His face had gone pale, lips tight, breath catching. "Wolfpack," I said, estimating distance by instinct. 5 miles, maybe more. Nothing to worry about. I kept moving steady and unhurried, but my eyes tracked his posture. His nervousness wasn't just the reflex of someone hearing predators in the distance. It was deeper, rawer. Mason looked like a man spooked not by nature, but by the realization that nature wasn't going to bend for him. Strange, I thought, for someone who had insisted so forcefully on this route into isolation. 3 hours of steady hiking brought us to a clearing beside a narrow, fast-moving creek, a Russian creek, locals called it. It was perfect by every measure: flat ground for tents, fresh water for drinking, and clear lines of sight in all directions. To me, it looked like safety, a temporary foothold in a land designed to test human limits. My military instincts clicked in automatically. I scanned the perimeter, plotted defensive positions, identified escape routes without even thinking. Mason collapsed heavily onto a fallen log chest, rising and falling with exertion. Sweat had darkened his shirt across the back. "How much farther?" he asked, voice tinged with exhaustion, almost pleading. "This is good for tonight," I said firmly. "We'll push deeper tomorrow." Setting up camp revealed even more of Mason's inexperience. While I worked methodically, establishing a perimeter, hanging our food cache 12 feet high, marking off cooking and sleeping areas with the wind direction in mind, and laying out emergency supplies for quick access, he wrestled with his tent like it was a puzzle designed to mock him. "Dad, can you help with this?" He held up a mess of tangled guidelines, sagging in his hands like surrender flags. I crouched beside him, showing him the proper technique: simple steps, order, patience. For a moment it felt almost like old times when he'd been a boy, eager to learn, eyes bright with curiosity, before adulthood had dulled that hunger into expectation of inheritance. But the thought clung to me like the damp air: why drag us into the wilderness if you couldn't even handle basic equipment? What was he really chasing out here? By the time the campfire was burning, the clearing had taken on an otherworldly glow. Shadows leapt and danced along the tree line, flickering in rhythm with the flames. The forest beyond remained impenetrable, its silence broken only by the occasional crack of ice shifting in the creek. I cooked a simple meal, the motions automatic, while Mason sat cross-legged near the fire. He was unusually quiet, eyes locked on the flames, as though they held secrets he couldn't untangle. The temperature dropped steadily. Alaska nights in March were not to be underestimated. The cold crept in deliberate and merciless. I pulled my jacket tighter, watching my son's profile in the firelight. Hoping to bridge the widening silence, I tried gently. Remember when we used to do this? You were 10, maybe. Insisted on roasting marshmallows until they caught fire. His eyes flickered just for a moment. Mom was still alive, then he said, his voice carrying a weight I didn't expect. She loved those trips. Said camping brought out the best in people. The words landed like stones in my chest. Mason nodded faintly, but his gaze remained far away, locked in the fire's hypnotic dance. After a long silence, he asked, "Tell me about your childhood dad. Before the military. Before the business. What was it like? Being poor?" The question caught me off guard. Mason rarely, if ever, showed interest in my beginnings. I shifted, staring into the fire, the crackle and pop of burning wood pulling me back decades. Slowly, I found myself speaking of Montana, the endless fields, the dust, the smell of wheat and sweat. Summers spent working farms for pennies, nights when the cupboards were bare winters, where every dollar was earned through calloused hands and aching backs. Mason listened, his face unreadable. When I finally stopped, he said simply, "Sounds hard." And the way he said it, flat, distant, like a man filing away evidence, unsettled me far more than the wolves in the distance. But his tone, it didn't land like empathy. It wasn't the warm echo of a son trying to understand his father's struggles. It carried the sharp edge of calculation, like he was cataloging weaknesses, weighing costs against benefits. "Hard work built character," I said slowly, my voice firmer than I intended. "It taught me the value of earning what you have." For a flicker of a moment, something passed across Mason's face. Not admiration, not even curiosity. It was something darker, resentment, maybe, or frustration that he couldn't quite conceal. But when he finally spoke, his voice was careful, stripped of emotion. "Lucky for me, right? Getting to skip all that character building." The words cut differently than I expected, wrapped in mockery more than gratitude. I studied him across the firelight, wondering if this was a joke or something deeper. His eyes, though, stayed steady on the flames, refusing to meet mine. The conversation wound on. Mason asked more questions, pointed, deliberate. He wanted stories of my military service, of survival training, of how I'd endured hostile environments where failure meant death. Normally, I would have kept those tales brief, guarded, but something about his questions loosened my tongue. Maybe it was the fire's warmth, maybe the illusion of connection after years of distance. I spoke more than I should have. "How do you know when someone's lying to you?" he asked, suddenly breaking the rhythm of the stories. I paused, the fire popping sharply between us. Body language, voice patterns, inconsistencies in their story. I poked the burning logs with a stick, sending sparks spiraling upward into the dark. "Why?" he shrugged, eyes still locked on the flames. "Just curious." "You've always been good at reading people," he added quietly, almost too quietly, as though he wanted me to believe it was a compliment. But the words carried a weight I couldn't shake. Later, as I banked the fire for the night, silence settled heavy over the campsite. It wasn't just silence, it was peace, the kind I hadn't felt since my last deployment. The stars stretched vast and clear, unmarred by city glow, the wilderness wrapping around us like something ancient, untouched, sacred. I breathed deep, letting that serenity settle in my bones. "I'll take first watch," Mason offered. His voice was casual, almost eager. Not really tired yet. I looked at him, surprised. "You sure we've got a long day tomorrow?" "Yeah, I want to enjoy this," he said. "Listen to the forest sounds." It sounded reasonable enough, even wholesome. I nodded, then crawled into my tent, trusting him the way a father trusts his son, the way instinct had taught me to trust my brothers in arms. Through the nylon walls, I heard him moving around the fire, shifting logs, adjusting his seat, settling into position. Normal camping noises, the kind that should have been comforting. But as exhaustion pulled at me, unease lingered. Mason had never been one for solitude, never cared for quiet reflection or the music of crickets and wind in the trees. Why start now? Why here, in a place where nature could devour the unprepared? The last thing I noticed before sleep dragged me under was the sound, or rather the absence of it. No casual movements, no restless shifting, just stillness. Stillness that felt less like watching and more like waiting. Dawn came harsh and cold, its pale light filtering through the fabric of my tent. My eyes opened to the faint metallic clatter of equipment. Not the lazy shuffling of a camper starting coffee, but sharp, deliberate clanking. Too early, too efficient, too urgent. I unzipped the flap, and the frigid Alaskan air rushed in each breath, hanging white in front of me. Mason was already at the truck, his hands moving with precision I hadn't seen in him before. He wasn't fumbling or second-guessing. He was methodically packing gear, quick, efficient, practiced. Military efficient. Skills I'd never taught him. Skills he was never supposed to have. Every piece of survival gear vanished into the truck with deliberate precision: GPS device, emergency beacon. Rifle food containers, all swallowed by the vehicle's shadow, like lifelines being stripped away one by one. "What's going on?" My voice cut through the brittle silence of morning like a blade. Mason froze, startled, then straightened with an almost military stiffness. His posture wasn't defensive, it was defiant. "Getting ready to leave," he said flatly. "Leave." My eyes narrowed. "We planned 3 more days out here. What's the rush change of plans?" He didn't look at me as he spoke, just kept moving his hands, shoving equipment into place with forced efficiency. "What kind of change?" I pressed. "The weather's turning bad." The lie was thin, fragile, already falling apart. Yesterday's forecast had been flawless, and this morning's sky stretched wide and clear, not a hint of storm on the horizon. Stillness pressed in around us, heavy as stone. My instincts, those sharp, honed senses that had slept quietly since I arrived in Alaska, flared to life in an instant, screaming warnings I could no longer ignore. "Mason," I said carefully. My voice low, measured the way I'd talk to an armed enemy whose next move I couldn't predict. "Talk to me. What's really happening here?" Something cracked in his expression. A fissure of raw emotion split the mask he'd been wearing, and in the space of a breath, years of carefully suppressed bitterness flooded his face. It was like watching a dam rupture. "You want to know what's happening?" His voice shook, not from weakness, but from fury too long contained. "I'm done. Done with your control, your manipulation, your constant judgment." "Son, I don't understand." "Don't." His voice was sharp, a whip cracking in the cold air. He spun fists, bald eyes burning. "Don't call me son. Sons don't get treated like employees. Sons don't have to beg for every dollar while their father sits on millions." The venom in his words struck harder than any physical blow. I staggered, not outwardly, but inside where a father's heart should have been shielded. "This isn't just anger," I whispered almost to myself. "This has been building for years." "You're damn right it has." His face twisted, his voice breaking with rage. "You think you've given me everything? You've given me nothing? You didn't raise me, you kept me on a leash, made me dependent, weak, controlled every part of my life with your checkbook." His hands trembled as he jabbed a finger at my chest. "Well, guess what? I'm done being your puppet. I'm taking control now." My hands shook too, but for a different reason, the slow dawning horror of realization. This camping trip, this father-son getaway, it hadn't been about bonding. It had been a setup. This whole thing, I breathed, my voice raw. The camping trip, it was planned. Finally, he laughed, a cruel, humorless sound that sliced through the crisp morning. "Finally catching on, military genius. Took you long enough." "Why Mason?" I asked, my voice breaking. "If you needed money, we could have worked something out." "I would have. I don't want your scraps anymore." His tone sharpened into steel. "I don't want your allowance, Dad. I want what's mine. What's owed to me by right. My business, my assets." I stared at him, every word heavier than the last. "Everything I built. Everything you've been dangling over my head for decades," he spat. "That's mine now." The air turned colder, sharper, as though even nature recoiled from the poison seeping into this clearing. I looked at him and saw not my son, but a stranger wearing his face, speaking words that shattered 2 decades of love, sacrifice, and hope. "You're planning to leave me here." It wasn't a question anymore. It was a truth I could feel like a knife in my ribs. "Very good." His mouth twisted into something between a sneer and a smile. "Yes, I'm leaving you here to figure things out for yourself. Maybe 30 miles of wilderness will teach you what real dependence feels like." My chest tightened, constricted, my breath fogging in the icy air. Mason, this is bear country. Without equipment, without GPS, you should have thought about that before you made me into your puppet. His voice was merciless. He slammed the tailgate shut with a finality that echoed like a gunshot. Maybe you'll survive, maybe you won't. Either way, I'll inherit what should have been mine years ago. I stumbled forward, desperate, my voice cracking into the silence. Please. The word tore out of me, scraping my throat raw like broken glass. Whatever I did wrong, we can fix it. Don't do this, please. For the briefest flicker of time, half a heartbeat, something shifted across his face, a shadow of hesitation. Maybe it was doubt, maybe the faintest spark of remembered affection. For a moment I thought I saw my son again, the boy who once clutched my hand at the county fair, who used to fall asleep on my shoulder during long car rides. But then just as quickly it vanished. His expression hardened, turned to ice sculpted into something unrecognizable. His eyes, those same eyes that once lit up when I taught him how to ride a bike, looked at me like I was nothing but an obstacle to be removed. Goodbye, Dad. The words were delivered without tremor, without mercy. He climbed into the driver's seat, his movements steady, unhurried. He might as well have been starting the truck for an ordinary drive into town. But this time his words were daggers. Try not to meet the Grizzlies too quickly. I want you to have time to think about what you created. The engine roared to life, shattering the stillness of the wilderness. My chest constricted as panic surged. Mason, I stepped toward the truck. My arm outstretched like I could pull him back from this edge with sheer will alone. Don't do this, please. You don't understand what you're... But he wasn't listening. He shifted into reverse tires, grinding against gravel, and began to back away. I caught his face through the windshield one last time, cold, calculated, devoid of any filial warmth. It was the face of a stranger wearing my son's skin. Mason, I roared, my voice echoing off the distant mountains, swallowed by their indifference. The truck jolted forward, tires spitting dust, and then it was gone. Around a bend, swallowed by the trees. The growl of the engine grew fainter, then fainter still, until it was nothing. And then silence. The kind of silence that presses down on you, absolute and suffocating. No human sounds. No mechanical noise. Only the whisper of wind weaving through spruce branches, the faint trickle of melting snow, and the lonely predatory cry of a hawk somewhere high above. Dust hung in the air around my boots, settling like the last trace of civilization being erased from my world. I stood there motionless, my mind struggling to process the enormity of what had just happened. My son, my only son. The boy I had raised, sheltered, provided for, devoted my life to had just driven away and left me for dead. He hadn't abandoned me in anger. He hadn't stormed off in some youthful tantrum. No, he had sentenced me to death. Calculated, deliberate. And I felt that truth crushed down on me, heavier than any weight I'd carried in combat. The dust from Mason's truck was still suspended in the air when instinct surged. My military training slammed into place, forcing its way through the haze of shock. Emotion would get me killed. Shock was a luxury I couldn't afford, not 30 miles from civilization, not in the heart of Alaskan grizzly country. I forced myself to inhale slowly, evenly, the way I'd learned in the Navy when chaos raged around me. Discipline over despair, logic over fear. First rule of survival, assess your resources. My hands moved automatically, patting down my pockets. Wallet, house keys, a small folding knife I'd nearly forgotten I carried. That was it. No food, no water, no GPS, no emergency beacon. Just the clothes on my back and the bitter betrayal of the son I thought I knew. Second rule, evaluate the environment. March in Alaska meant frigid nights, the kind of cold that could creep into your bones and never leave. I scanned the terrain, dense spruce forest stretching into the horizon. No trail markers, no sign of human presence. Ranger Walsh's voice whispered through memory, recent grizzly activity. Wolf packs sighted. Weather turning without warning. The odds were stacked against me, but odds had never stopped me before. Third rule, prioritize survival needs. Shelter, water, signaling, navigation, in that exact order. I tilted my head back, studying the position of the sun as I had 1,000 times before. East would only take me deeper into wilderness. South might eventually cut toward a river system, maybe even a road if I could survive long enough to find it. The silence pressed in again, but this time I didn't let it smother me. I let it sharpen me. The betrayal of my son burned in my chest, but I pushed it down, burying it beneath the steel of survival instinct. There would be time to mourn later if I lived. Right now, there was only one mission: survive. West eventually stumbled onto what he believed was the main park road, though the distance he had traveled and the exact location remained uncertain. His aging memory strained, dragging fragments of topographical knowledge from the ranger station briefing hours earlier. He tried to reconstruct the map in his mind, though it came in pieces, half-remembered lines and vague contours. Rivers he recalled ran northwest, feeding into larger systems that eventually touched the park boundary. If he could find water, he could survive. If he could keep moving, he had a chance. Standing still meant death. So he walked westward. I lowered my eyes to the ground, following the faint tread marks Mason's truck had pressed into the earth. Within 100 yards, the tracks veered away, swallowed by undergrowth, while a narrower trail, trampled by hooves and paws, cut into the dense brush. A game trail. I knew enough to recognize what that meant: water, shelter, maybe visibility for any rescue team that might be searching. My legs protested immediately. Every step was a conscious act of will. At 58, my knees had grown brittle, my back stiff, my body softened by years of civilian life. This was not the man I had been in uniform, not the warrior who could march 20 miles under full pack without hesitation. This body was slower, weaker. But rage carried me forward, raw, burning anger that Mason had abandoned me, betrayed me, condemned me. The forest thickened around me, swallowing the light. Towering spruce trees rose like cathedral pillars, their branches knitting together so tightly overhead that even at noon the woods sank into a hushed twilight. It felt as though the forest itself had closed in a living tunnel, pulling me deeper. I broke branches as I walked, snapping them at intervals, leaving crude trail markers behind. Some part of me knew it was probably pointless. Rescue in this vast wilderness was nearly impossible. But survival demanded discipline, and discipline demanded habit. Then I saw them. Signs. Tree bark shredded with deep claw marks, patches of earth pressed by massive paws, 5 claws arching forward in unmistakable arcs. Droppings steaming faintly, disturbingly fresh. Bears. And not just passing through territorial. This was their ground. I forced myself to remember Ranger Walsh's words: make noise. Don't surprise them. Let them know you're there. So I began to talk aloud, my voice rough, filling the silence. Easy there. Just passing through. Nothing you want here. The irony clawed at me. I had to defend myself against bears, but it was my own son who had truly thrown me to the wolves. Hours bled away. My throat tightened, grew dry, then parched. My tongue felt like leather. The trail twisted maddeningly, weaving in and out of dense thickets. More than once I lost it completely and had to backtrack each mistake, stealing precious minutes of daylight. My legs burned. My chest ached. Stopping was tempting, but stopping meant death. And then sound. I froze, every muscle taut. Not the forest, not wind, not bird, not predator. Mechanical, rhythmic, engines, more than one. I held my breath and listened. The hum came from the north, faint but unmistakable. ATVs, maybe, motorcycles, something human. My heart slammed against my ribs. Hunters, rangers, rescue. Hope, savage, blinding hope surged through me for the first time since Mason had left me choking in his dust. I turned north, forcing my way through thick brush. Branches clawed at my clothes, tore at my face, but I didn't care. The sound grew louder, distinct now, the sputter and growl of all-terrain engines, moving slowly, deliberately, as though sweeping the area. The forest began to thin. Light spilled through gaps in the trees. I caught glimpses of open space ahead, a clearing, the promise of safety. The engines were close now, 200 yards, maybe less. I abandoned stealth for speed. My breath tore in ragged gasps, my legs pumping, my hands batting aside branches as I pushed through the final wall of undergrowth. Salvation was just beyond reach, and I ran for it. Breaking through the tree line, I staggered forward and stumbled into a wide clearing, blinking against the sudden spill of sunlight. The silence of the deep forest broke instantly. The clearing was not empty. 4 ATVs stood parked in a rough circle, their engines cooling, while their riders sat with lunch spread across their laps. The smell of jerky and trail mix mingled with the faint tang of gasoline. All four heads snapped up in unison as I lurched out of the woods, scratched filthy and gasping like some half-mad castaway. For a moment, no one moved. Their faces registered the same emotion, shock. I knew how I must have looked, hair matted with sweat clothing, torn and streaked with dirt blood dried along my forearms from clawing through brush. A man utterly out of place in this unforgiving wilderness. The lead rider rose first. He was in his 40s, broad-shouldered, with the kind of weather-beaten skin that only comes from years outdoors. A trimmed beard framed his jaw, and his eyes, sharp and assessing, locked on me immediately. He cut the engine of his ATV and strode forward, voice calm, but edged with authority. "Sir, Mom, what happened? Why are you out here alone?" I opened my mouth, but my voice cracked into a rasp, sandpaper from thirst and exhaustion. The words barely formed. My son, Mason, he left me out here. Took everything, our equipment, our truck. He drove off." The bearded man froze, mid-step, disbelief flashing across his face. He repeated the words slowly, as if trying to be sure he heard right. "Someone abandoned you here." In this, he gestured at the endless sweep of trees, the raw wilderness pressing in all around. His jaw tightened. "That's not just abandonment, that's attempted murder." I swallowed, forcing clarity into my voice. "My name is William Harper. My son Mason Harper brought me out here on a camping trip. I thought—" My chest clenched. "I thought it was just supposed to be time together. But he told me he was leaving me to die. And then he drove away with everything we had." "Jesus Christ," one of the other riders muttered under their breath. The bearded man removed his helmet, revealing dark, intelligent eyes that never stopped moving, scanning my face, my trembling hands, the scratches crisscrossing my arms. He wasn't just listening. He was evaluating, measuring the truth in every word. "I'm Oliver Reed," he said finally, his tone clipped professional. "Used to be a park ranger in these parts. These are my friends. We're doing a backcountry tour." The others gathered closer now. One of them, a woman in her 30s with a windburned face and a look of genuine alarm, immediately dug into her pack and thrust a water bottle into my hands. I gripped it with shaking fingers, drained half in one desperate gulp, the cold liquid sliding down my parched throat like salvation. "How long ago did this happen?" Oliver asked. His voice had shifted from curiosity to urgency. I wiped my mouth, the water bottle trembling in my grasp. "This morning. 4 hours ago. Maybe a little more." Oliver turned to his companions, exchanging grim looks with them. I could feel the weight of their understanding, people who knew the backcountry, who knew just how lethal this land could be without gear, water, or shelter. Their faces mirrored the horror, the deep violation outdoor people feel when they see wilderness used as a weapon. "We need to get you out of here immediately," Oliver said flatly. One of the men nodded, already reaching for a small radio clipped to his pack, though Oliver raised a hand. "Radio range is patchy here," he explained, already pulling a GPS unit from his vest pocket. "But if we get to higher ground, we can reach the ranger station." Then his eyes narrowed at the device, studying it, with the familiarity of a man who had spent years reading terrain. "There's something else," he said slowly. "If your son took the main park road out, he's looking at a 6-hour drive minimum before he even reaches Anchorage." But he jabbed at a line on the map glowing on the GPS screen. "I know a shortcut, an old ranger trail that cuts through the backcountry. We can get you back to the park entrance in 90 minutes, maybe less." Hope and fear warred in my chest. 90 minutes to safety? 90 minutes between me and the death Mason had planned for me? And suddenly, for the first time since he left me, I felt the fragile edge of survival tilt back in my favor. The implication struck me like a jolt of electricity running from the base of my spine all the way to my fingertips. "You mean I could get back before him?" I asked, hardly daring to believe it. Oliver's reply was calm, almost matter-of-fact. "Easily. The question is, do you want to involve law enforcement immediately, or do you have something else in mind?" For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The fear that had stalked me since dawn, the gnawing panic of being left to die, seemed to melt away. In its place, something colder, sharper, more deliberate began to form inside my chest. Mason had calculated my death as if it were nothing more than a schedule on his calendar. He had dragged me out here, stripped me of my supplies, stolen our truck, and left me to vanish into the endless sprawl of Alaskan wilderness. He had counted on my helplessness. But Mason had miscalculated. He had underestimated two things: the solidarity of those who lived and breathed this wilderness and my own will to survive. I want to get back to the motel first, I said slowly, measuring every word before I decide anything about the police. Oliver studied me for only a second before nodding. He didn't press. He didn't need to. Something unspoken passed between us, the kind of understanding forged in desperate situations. "Climb on behind me," he said, adjusting his helmet. "We'll take the ranger trail. Your son will never see us coming." The ATV roared to life beneath us, its vibration rattling up through my bones as Oliver steered toward a narrow, almost invisible path threading into the trees. The moment we entered it, the forest swallowed us whole. The ride was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Hidden among the vast wilderness was a secret latticework of ranger trails, service roads and backcountry access routes invisible to tourists, known only to rangers, search and rescue teams, and the most serious of backcountry guides. Oliver navigated with a confidence born of long years patrolling this land. Every turn seemed instinctive to him, every fork in the trail already mapped in his mind. "I spent 15 years as a ranger here," he shouted over the engine's roar. "I've seen my share of accidents, careless mistakes, people getting lost. But this," his voice hardened, "deliberate abandonment. That's criminal territory." The scenery whipped past in a blur creek crossings where water splashed up cold against my legs. Steep inclines that sent the machine growling as it clawed upward. Sections of trails so blocked with fallen trees, we had to dismount and guide the ATV around. And yet, despite the obstacles, we pushed forward relentlessly. Somewhere along that punishing ride, I realized something had shifted inside me. The fear was gone. In its place was focus, cold, precise, and unyielding. We broke out of the forest far sooner than I expected, tires grinding against pavement. Oliver's prediction had been conservative. We had made better time than even he guessed. And there across a stretch of road rose the Denali Lodge Motel. Its log cabin architecture, quaint and rustic, might have seemed ordinary under different circumstances. But after a morning of near death in the wilderness, it looked like salvation itself. My eyes swept the parking lot instantly, hunting for the rental truck. It wasn't there. Relief and adrenaline surged together. "Looks like your son's still on the road," Oliver observed, slowing the ATV to a stop. His tone carried both practicality and a faint edge of grim satisfaction. "That means you've got time to prepare whatever reception you're planning." The other riders dismounted, approaching me one by one. They pressed contact information into my hands, promising to stand as witnesses if the situation escalated to court. Their faces were a mixture of anger and sympathy. Anger at Mason's cruelty, sympathy for the father he had betrayed. Finally, Oliver handed me a card. Heavy stock, his name printed above a personal cell number and email address. "Call me when you're ready to talk to authorities," he said. "What your son did, there need to be consequences." I nodded, slipping the card into my jacket pocket where it rested against another folded document, the legal papers Mason had never intended me to use. As the group prepared to leave, Oliver hesitated. He glanced at me, his gaze steady. "Sir, do you mind me asking, what exactly are you planning to do when he gets back?" For a long moment, I didn't answer. My eyes drifted toward the row of motel rooms to the door where our shared belongings waited. My hand brushed the pocket where the papers lay crisp and unyielding against the fabric. Mason had spent years plotting my ruin, building his schemes brick by brick, planning down to the smallest detail how he would erase me from his life. But plans cut both ways. Now, it was my turn to plan his. "I'm going to give him exactly what he wants," I murmured, my voice steady but carrying the weight of steel beneath it. "Just not the way he expects to get it." Back in the motel room, the silence pressed against me like a physical weight. The patterned curtains swayed slightly in the breeze from the window unit, and for a brief moment the ordinary domestic quiet mocked the storm inside my chest. I sat heavily on the edge of the bed, the springs creaking under me, and pulled out my phone. Beside me on the nightstand lay Oliver's card, an open lifeline, his cell number written in neat black ink. He had offered to call the authorities immediately to bring the law down on Mason with swift precision. It was tempting, so very tempting, to end it quickly. But I wasn't ready. Not yet. First, I needed to understand exactly what battlefield I was standing on. The legal documents I'd carried all the way from Seattle suddenly felt prophetic, as if I'd been preparing for this war long before I realized it had begun. They were folded neatly in my jacket pocket, sharp and unyielding, like a hidden blade. 3 weeks ago, in a fit of paternal disappointment, I had sat across from my attorney and changed my will. At the time, it had felt like a bitter precaution, a symbolic reprimand for Mason's greed. But now, as I withdrew the papers and spread them across the motel's small desk, that act no longer felt like precaution, it felt like divine foresight. Line by line, paragraph by paragraph, the truth stared back at me. Mason would inherit nothing. Not the house, not the business, not a single dime of the fortune he believed he had already counted. Instead, everything, every dollar, every acre, every share would go elsewhere, to wildlife conservation charities, to veterans organizations, to a scholarship fund in Sarah's name. Sarah, his mother, my wife, the one he had chosen to forget in pursuit of his own ambition. The irony was exquisite. Mason's attempt to murder me for inheritance would leave him with exactly what he had earned, nothing. But even as I savored that cruel symmetry, I knew it wasn't enough. Words on paper, no matter how ironclad, couldn't capture the full gravity of his betrayal. If this was going to end, it needed to end with more than legal clauses. I needed evidence, witnesses, proof that could follow Mason for the rest of his life, like a shadow he could never outrun. My hand tightened on the phone, and I dialed. Oliver answered on the first ring. William Yu settled in. All right, I said, steadying my breath. I need your help with something specific. There was a pause, a subtle shift in his tone as he replied, Go on. When Mason returns, I said carefully, I want everything documented. His reaction, his words, every slip of his tongue. I don't just want him arrested. I want a jury to see the truth in his own voice. Oliver was quiet for a beat, then asked, You planning to confront him before calling the police? A bitter smile tugged at the corner of my mouth. I'm planning to give him exactly what he thought he wanted, the chance to inherit my business. I let the silence stretch before finishing, right up until the moment he realizes what he's actually done to himself. On the other end of the line, silence lingered. I could almost hear Oliver weighing my words, testing their weight in his own mind. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and deliberate. That's strategic. You want me there as a witness, if you're willing, I replied, and maybe bring that digital camera you had on the trail. Mason is going to say things that need to be preserved for more than just my memory, for a jury, for history, maybe. Oliver exhaled slowly. All right, consider it done. What time are you expecting him? I leaned back in the chair, calculating Mason's route with the precision of a hunter, mapping the movements of prey. From the main park road, he would merge onto the Anchorage highway. He would stop, he always stopped for gas, for food, for the small comforts he couldn't resist. And Mason was cautious, too cautious, whenever driving unfamiliar roads. Between 9 and 10 tonight, I said finally. By then he'll be tired, overconfident, certain of his success. He'll expect to find an empty room, the grieving echo of a father who never made it back from the wilderness. I looked toward the motel door, my hand brushing once more against the folded documents in my jacket pocket. My heart thudded with a strange mix of dread and exhilaration. Instead, I whispered more to myself than to Oliver. He'll find his intended victim very much alive and very, very well prepared. After Oliver agreed to arrive by 8:30, I made one more call to my attorney back in Seattle. The conversation was short-measured, but it carried the weight of years of trust and urgency. Tomorrow morning, no matter what happened tonight, whether I was alive to see it or not, the new will would be filed officially. By then, Mason's inheritance would vanish like smoke in the wind. The moment those papers hit the courthouse, every cent, every asset, every dream of easy wealth he had built in his mind would be erased. It was a safeguard, one last fatherly act, not to protect him, but to protect everything and everyone else from him. When the call ended, I sat in silence for a moment, staring at the phone in my hand. It felt like cutting the final thread between us. The boy I had raised was gone, replaced by a man who saw me only as an obstacle to his fortune. That realization carved deep into my chest, but I forced myself to breathe evenly. There was no room for grief tonight. Grief would weaken me, Strategy would keep me alive. Next, I contacted the motel office. My request was simple: an adjacent room for my friend who'd be arriving shortly. The desk clerk, a silver-haired woman with the kind of face that had witnessed half a century of Alaskan winters, didn't so much as blink. She had probably seen hunters return, bloody miners' drunk marriages fall apart, and tourists disappear into the wilderness, never to be found. My request, unusual as it was, didn't warrant a single question. She slid the key across the counter with the quiet efficiency of someone who understood that sometimes silence was the best service she could provide. As evening crept closer, time seemed to slow. The motel room was a bland little square of beige walls and humming air vents, but to me it had become a war room. I showered, washing away the grime of the wilderness, the sweat and the lingering scent of pine and fear. Dressed in clean clothes, I felt more like myself, sharper, calmer, armored in preparation. Then methodically I arranged the room. The legal documents, my final blow, were spread neatly across the desk, where Mason would see them the moment he walked in. A silent announcement that the future he had imagined for himself was gone. My phone, resting on the nightstand, was programmed with 911 on speed dial. Oliver's camera, I knew, would have a perfect line of sight from the connecting room. Every angle was covered, every word Mason uttered would be captured, preserved, undeniable. I thought back to my military years, to the lesson drilled into me again and again. Preparation eliminates variables. A soldier who controlled his environment controlled the outcome. Tonight I wasn't just a father waiting for his son. I was a strategist setting the board, and Mason would be walking into a controlled environment where every advantage belonged to me. The irony wasn't lost on me. My son had spent months planning my death in the wild, calculating, manipulating, waiting for nature to swallow me whole. Now I was planning his death too, not of his body but of his reputation, his freedom, his illusions of grandeur. My plan wouldn't bury him under Alaskan snow. It would leave him standing alive, forced to face the wreckage of his own choices in the full glare of civilization's justice. At exactly 8:15, a soft knock came at the door. My chest tightened, then eased as I opened it to see Oliver. He entered quietly, carrying not only his professional camera gear, but also the hardened expression of a man who had witnessed too many tragedies. His eyes flicked over the room, once taking in the documents, the placement of the furniture, the readiness in my posture. "Recording equipment's set up in the next room," he said in a low voice. He gestured toward the connecting door. "Audio and video clear coverage of this space. When he arrives, you'll have everything documented." I nodded, the weight of inevitability pressing against me. "And legally, what happens when we hand this over?" Oliver's jaw tightened, his words steady but grim. "Attempted murder in the first degree. Alaska law doesn't play games with wilderness abandonment. Out here, leaving someone to die isn't just negligence, it's a death sentence with extra steps." His words hit me harder than I expected. I stared at the papers on the desk, at the cruel elegance of it all. Mason had tried to kill me for money. By the time this was over, the money would be gone, the evidence preserved, and the law would be waiting. For the first time that day, I felt the faintest flicker of pity for him. Then I crushed it. Tonight wasn't about pity. Tonight was about truth and consequences that could no longer be avoided. "With your testimony, my witness statement, and whatever he says tonight, he's looking at serious prison time." Oliver's words hung in the air like a gavel already fallen. I nodded, and for the first time in weeks, I felt something other than fear, something cold, steady, and sharp. Satisfaction. Justice might be slow, but tonight it had teeth. "Then we wait," I said quietly. Outside, night pressed against the thin motel walls. The dark gathered around the building like a closing fist, suffocating and heavy. Through the small window, I could see the empty road cutting across the wilderness, black as ink except for the occasional flicker of passing headlights. Any minute now, Mason would appear, driving toward what he thought was freedom, driving straight into the trap he'd built for himself. The phone on the nightstand glowed. 8:47 p.m. My pulse matched its silent rhythm. Any second now, the son who had calculated every detail of my death would discover his perfect crime had become his perfect downfall. And then there they were, headlights sweeping across the parking lot. My chest tightened as I heard the familiar sound of the rental truck's engine. Mason's return. I could almost see him in my mind, hands gripping the steering wheel, lips rehearsing the performance of a grieving son. The call he'd planned to make to authorities, his voice thick with false sorrow, reporting that his father had tragically vanished into the Alaskan wilderness. But that stage was gone. Tonight the script was mine. I positioned myself in the chair directly facing the door. The desk before me was a battlefield laid bare, the legal documents spread neatly visible at first glance. They would be the first thing Mason's eyes landed on, the very weapons of his undoing. From the adjoining room, faint noises reached me. Oliver adjusting his recording equipment, testing angles, calibrating audio. Every sound made my heart beat steadier. Everything was ready. The quiet was broken by the metallic scrape of a key. Once, twice. Then the lock clicked. Mason's key. The door opened slowly, cautiously, as if he half expected the room to be empty. He stepped inside, his movements calculated but uncertain, and then the overhead light caught his face. Recognition slammed into him like a punch to the gut. His eyes widened. His breath caught. His lips moved before his mind seemed ready. "Dad?" The word came out strangled, disbelieving, almost childlike. "Hello, son." I leaned back slightly, my tone casual, like I'd been waiting for a dinner guest. "How was your drive?" His expression flickered. Confusion, shock, fear, all colliding in rapid succession. How are you here? How did you get back?" I let a small, humorless smile touch my lips. "Turns out I'm harder to kill than you calculated." He faltered, his knees almost giving out. He gripped the doorframe like it was the only thing anchoring him. His eyes darted across the room, scanning corners, searching for exits that weren't there. I don't understand," he stammered. "I left you 30 miles out, 30 miles from nowhere. No food, no water, no gear." Yes, I cut in smoothly, my voice calm, almost conversational. "I remember." I tilted my head. Interesting choice of last words, by the way. "Go meet the Grizzlies." Really captured the sentiment beautifully. His face blanched. "Dad, wait. You don't understand." "Oh, I understand perfectly." My tone hardened, steel wrapped in velvet. "You brought me to Alaska to murder me for my inheritance. Spent months planning it, researching the most remote location possible, rehearsing your shock son routine for when the authorities found my body." Mason's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping on dry land. Sweat beaded on his forehead, despite the cool night air drifting in through the cracked window. "The problem with your plan," I continued, standing, slowly letting my shadow stretch across the room, "is that you underestimated the wilderness. You thought it would finish what you started. But you didn't account for the people who live here, the ones who help each other survive instead of abandoning their own blood to die." He shook his head desperately. "Look, if this is about money," I laughed once, a sharp, bitter sound. "It was always about money for you. That's what I finally understand. Every conversation we had, every camping trip, every moment I thought was father-son bonding." My voice broke just for a second, then hardened again. "You were calculating my net worth." I walked to the desk, picked up the stack of legal documents, and held them where he couldn't avoid seeing the official seals and signatures. "You want to know what's fascinating?" I asked. 3 weeks ago, after our last fight, I changed my will. I called it paternal disappointment at the time. His eyes snapped to the papers, locking onto them with naked hunger and dawning horror. "What do you mean, changed?" His voice cracked. "I mean," I said, slowly savoring the words, "you inherit nothing. Not the auto shops, not the bank accounts, not the house your mother loved, not a cent." The silence that followed was heavier than any storm. His chest heaved, his jaw clenched, and for the first time I saw something raw and unfiltered in my son's eyes, not anger, not calculation, but terror. And yet it was only the beginning. Everything goes to charity, to wildlife conservation, to veterans organizations, to scholarship funds in Sarah's name. The words landed like a hammer blow. I watched the color drain from Mason's face until he looked almost ghostly, the blood retreating, as though even his body understood the finality of what I had just said. You can't do that," he stammered, his voice cracking. "I'm your son." I shook my head slowly, my voice calm but unyielding. "You were my son. This morning when you left me to die 30 miles from nowhere, you became something else entirely. A man who calculated his father's death for financial gain. Dad, please, he choked desperation, cutting through the arrogance he had worn like armor all his life. If you'll just listen, I did listen. I interrupted sharply, my patience finally gone. I listened this morning while you justified abandoning me. I listened when you explained how my so-called controlling behavior had ruined your life. And I listened when you said I deserved to die alone, picked apart by grizzlies in bear country. I'm done listening, Mason. The thin thread of composure he had been clinging to snapped. His face contorted raw anger, replacing fear. You self-righteous bastard, he shouted, his voice echoing harshly off the motel walls. You created this, all of it. Your constant control, your manipulation, keeping me dependent while judging every choice I made. Don't you dare put this all on me. There it is, I said quietly, almost to myself. The real Mason Harper. The mask finally gone. You want to destroy me? Fine, he spat, his chest heaving. But don't forget you made me into this. Every dollar you dangled like bait, every condition you tied to it, every time you reminded me that I wasn't enough unless I lived by your rules. This is your creation. For a moment I just studied him, the bitterness, the venom, the sheer refusal to own his choices. And strangely, instead of anger, a calm settled over me, heavy and resolute. You're absolutely right, I said at last. I did create this. I enabled your dependence. I bought your affection instead of earning your respect. I confused providing with parenting. That was my failure as a father. His eyes lit up, hope flaring desperately. Then change the will back. Fix this. You can undo it. The will was filed this afternoon, I said evenly. It's done. Irrevocable. Mason Harper inherits nothing. The hope vanished as quickly as it appeared, leaving behind a hollow, broken version of the man who had once been my son. I walked toward the door past him. He seemed smaller now, diminished, as if stripped of the one illusion that had fueled him. But you're wrong about one thing, I added, pausing at the threshold. I didn't create your willingness to commit murder. That was never mine to give. That choice was yours and yours alone. Mason's voice cracked, breaking into panic. Where are you going to call the police? I said. Attempted murder is still a felony, even when it fails. Dad, wait, he pleaded, his voice ragged with desperation. I stopped my hand on the doorknob and turned just enough to look at him one last time. Goodbye, Mason. In a strange way, you've given me exactly what I needed, absolute clarity about who you really are. And then I stepped outside into the cool Alaskan night, the air sharp against my skin, the silence almost cleansing. The last image burned into my mind was my son collapsing into the chair I had vacated, staring at the legal documents spread across the desk. The papers that sealed not only his financial ruin, but also the death of the illusion that he could ever profit from my grave. He had wanted an inheritance. What I had given him instead was truth, consequence, and a legacy of his own making. The fluorescent lights in the Anchorage Police Department interview room buzzed overhead, a constant, almost mocking reminder of where life had brought me. The walls were sterile, the air heavy with the faint smell of disinfectant and exhaustion, a place designed to strip away illusions, leaving only truth behind. Across the cold metal table sat Detective Sarah Martinez, her posture sharp, her eyes steady with the focus of someone who had seen far too many tragedies play out in these very rooms. Spread before her were the pieces of Mason's undoing, Oliver's pristine digital recordings, my sworn statement written in my own unshakable hand, and most damning of all, Mason's own voice captured in crystal clarity from that motel room. His arrogance, his venom, his intent, all laid bare in words that could never be taken back. She leaned forward, pressing a button on her laptop. Mason's voice filled the room, dripping with entitlement and rage. Martinez listened, her jaw tightening. Then she looked up at me. Mr. Harper, she said, her tone steady, but edged with something close to disbelief. I've been investigating wilderness crimes for 8 years. This is the most premeditated case of attempted murder I've ever encountered. Her finger tapped the laptop as though punctuating her words. Your son's statements are remarkably incriminating. He left nothing to interpretation. I gave a bitter smile. He always was thorough when he wanted something. She didn't smile back. Instead, she clicked through the files, assembling the pieces of a case that was already ironclad. The district attorney will file charges this morning, attempted murder in the first degree, reckless endangerment, and conspiracy to commit fraud regarding your inheritance. She paused, her gaze unwavering. Alaska doesn't treat wilderness abandonment lightly. Leaving someone to die out there, it's the same as pulling the trigger yourself. Sometimes worse. Through the reinforced glass window to my left, I saw him, my son. Mason Harper, 28 years old. Handcuffed, seated at the booking desk, his once confident posture collapsed inward. The night in a holding cell had stripped him of the last scraps of his charm. No manipulation, no smooth excuses, just a man caught in the unrelenting glare of truth, facing the consequences of calculated evil. Oliver sat beside me, his presence steady grounding. He had driven down from Denali to make sure his testimony was given in person. His camera had caught what my eyes alone never could have proven, and in doing so, he had handed me both justice and closure. I turned to the detective. "What's the likely sentence for something like this?" 15 to 25 years, Martinez answered without hesitation, depending on plea negotiations. Alaska law treats deliberate wilderness abandonment as attempted murder, because frankly, that's exactly what it is. Her words should have felt like triumph. But as I looked at Mason through the glass, all I felt was an empty ache. No satisfaction, no victory, just the inevitable end of years of choices, his entitlement, his resentment, his willingness to trade blood for money. Martinez broke the silence. "Will you be returning to Seattle tomorrow?" I said quietly. "I need to see my attorney here first. Finalize some estate planning documents." She gave a knowing nod. "Making sure your new will is airtight, among other things." I rose, gathering my jacket and the folders of evidence, their weight heavy but necessary. "I'm establishing a foundation," I told her, my voice softer now. "In my late wife's name. Seems appropriate that Mason's inheritance should help people who actually deserve it, students, veterans, conservationists, people who value life, not exploit it." Oliver stood with me, his expression solemn, and together we walked out into the crisp Anchorage morning. The cold air bit at my lungs, but it felt cleansing too, like the first real breath I had taken in years. Behind us, inside that gray building, Mason's world was collapsing. Ahead of us, the horizon was open, raw, uncertain, but mine to walk freely. For the first time since the wilderness ordeal began, I felt a fragile but undeniable peace. Downtown Anchorage moved at its own rhythm, a pace that felt distinctly Alaskan. Cars rolled along with a kind of unhurried practicality, drivers with no interest in honking or weaving their way ahead. People here seemed to understand that rushing rarely changed the destination. I sat in Oliver's truck watching the streets drift by when his voice broke the silence. "What happens now?" he asked, eyes on the road, but tone gentle, almost careful. I exhaled slowly, the weight of the past days pressing on me like invisible stone. "Back to Seattle," I said. "Back to my business, to the life I left behind. Back to figuring out what kind of man I want to be with whatever years I still have left." As I spoke, my gaze lifted to the Chugach Mountains, standing tall beyond the city skyline. Their snowy ridges caught the morning light, unyielding and eternal. For the first time, I saw them not as obstacles to survival, but as silent teachers. Turns out surviving your own child's attempt to murder you gives you remarkable clarity about priorities. Oliver let my words settle before asking, "You planning to visit him during the trial, I mean?" The question caught me off guard. It landed with a weight I hadn't expected, stirring something I thought was already decided. I turned it over in my mind, the instinct buried deep to maintain some kind of connection, warring violently against the truth of what Mason had tried to do. After a long silence, I shook my head. "No," I said finally. My voice was steady, though it trembled somewhere inside me. "The man I raised, he died somewhere in those woods yesterday morning. What's left, who's left, that isn't my son anymore." We walked the last few steps across the lot until we reached Oliver's truck. He stopped, reached into his jacket, and handed me a simple white business card with his name and number printed neatly across it. "If you ever want to come back to Alaska for the right reasons, camping, fishing, actually enjoying the wilderness instead of fighting it, call me," he said. "First trip's on the house." I frowned, slightly surprised. "Why would you do that?" Oliver gave me a small smile, one of quiet conviction. "Because you survived something that should have killed you, and instead of letting it make you bitter, you're choosing to turn it into something good for other people, not just yourself. That's worth supporting." I clasped his hand, feeling a surge of genuine gratitude for this man who had started as a stranger, but had become an unlikely ally in the most harrowing chapter of my life. Thank you, I said softly. Thank the wilderness community. You people, you look out for each other up here. He nodded once. Always. I stood watching as his truck pulled out of the lot and disappeared into traffic. For a long moment I remained there, the cold Alaskan air sharp in my lungs, the business card warm in my palm. Then I pulled out my phone, my decision already clear. I dialed my attorney back in Seattle. There were foundations to establish scholarships to create lives to touch. I had spent a lifetime confusing provision with love, enabling instead of guiding. Mason had dragged me to Alaska to die for money. Instead, I had learned to live for purpose. The irony struck me with a cold clarity in trying to destroy me. My son had taught me the very lesson I'd failed to teach him, the difference between giving someone everything and actually caring enough to give them what they truly need. 3 days later, back in my Seattle office, a letter arrived from the Anchorage Correctional Facility. It was from Mason, 5 pages long, written in a neat, almost desperate hand. Words cloaked in apology but dripping with manipulation. Promises of change if I would only reconsider the inheritance. Pleas about how prison would ruin his life, how I had the power to save him. I read it once, slowly letting each word settle. Then I fed the pages one by one into the shredder at the corner of my office. The machine's low growl swallowed every lie, every manipulation, every false promise. Some relationships don't survive betrayal, some don't survive greed, and some, no matter how much love or money you've poured into them, cannot survive attempted murder. And in that quiet office, surrounded by nothing but the hum of the shredder, I understood something with finality. I had lost a son, but found myself. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left.